Good morning, brethren.
Good morning.
All right, so I kind of go a little bit back and forth between some notes that I have on the computer, and then occasionally I might ask, and we'll see about how this goes, a couple of people to read a couple of passages from something that might make it a little bit more interesting. And let me get past my microphone here. So, excuse me, I want to get rid of the coffee this morning. My name is Daniel, and I am the Grand Secretary of Montana, and my talk this morning will be about, as Brother Tim noted, Thomas Smith Webb and William Preston. Those names should be familiar to all of us because the claim is, and I state claim, that Thomas Smith Webb adapted the ritual and lectures of one William Preston out of England. Spoiler alert, that's probably not true. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how we get to where we are and what we think may have been the ritual of William Preston and why that change and the multiple changes that happened afterwards actually occurred. So I'd like to start out with a little bit of background so we're all kind of on the same page. And my assumption is that all of us generally have the same understanding, but I might repeat a couple of things once or twice and add a detail here or there just to kind of recap so that we all go back and at the end of it, we have essentially the same base understanding. So my assumption is that everyone in the room has heard at least a minimum of that there was a Grand Lodge formed probably around 1717 in London. They were referred to as the Moderns Grand Lodge. That in 1751, there was a competing Grand Lodge that was formed also in London, largely by disaffected Irishmen living in London, the occasional Scotsman thrown into the mix, and then eventually several Londoners who also joined. My assumption is also that most of you have heard of, whether or not you're ultimately very familiar with, William Preston. Preston had been a Scotsman who moved to London, and while he was in London, a bunch of his friends from Scotland decided to petition the Grand Lodge of Scotland to form a lodge. Scotland suggested that they petition instead in London, as that would be their jurisdictions, among the Ancients Grand Lodge. And they did this, and after only briefly working under an Ancients charter, they quickly switched their allegiance to the Moderns Grand Lodge, as Preston and several of his fellows came to understand that under the way he perceived it, the Moderns Grand Lodge, being formed earlier, was the older and more authentic Grand Lodge. Shortly after doing this, he also discovered that one of the claimed 4 founding lodges of that Grand Lodge, the former Goose and Gridiron Tavern Lodge, was still in existence. And it had gone through a couple of names, but ultimately became known as what we think of today as the Lodge of Antiquity. So William Preston joins this Lodge of Antiquity, and while he's in the process of revising several rituals, he is ultimately expelled from the Moderns Grand Lodge, forms a competing Grand Lodge, taking out a charter from yet a third Grand Lodge called the Grand Lodge at York, which was probably less a Grand Lodge and more like a Mother Grand Lodge. They issued charters to people kind of indiscriminately, didn't follow up too much, and just kind of collected some fees from people. And Preston's Grand Lodge, the 4th Grand Lodge at that point, there are actually more, but we're going to kind of stick to those 4 main Grand Lodges for this purpose, is called the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent, which is a spectacular mouthful and fits everything. If you know anything at all about Preston, that sounds exactly in line with William Preston. Okay, William Preston, in his now own Grand Lodge, revises rituals that he's claimed to have created for the Moderns Grand Lodge. Shortly after that, he kind of disappears, comes back on the scene, and is welcomed with open arms, returns to the Moderns Grand Lodge, and then there's this galloping race for the Ancients and the Moderns to come together and reunite. And they form the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813, December 1813. 1814 to 16, they revise their rituals. Now that's the background I assume all of you have at least heard. Now you might not know all of the details, you might not know the incidentals or the names of the people involved, but I assume all of us have at least heard something like that somewhere. The reason why I'm going to assume that is because that base knowledge is necessary for where we're going to go from there. And the basic knowledge in the United States of our ritual similarly can be set up like this. The story as received, kind of like that story, is that a Mason in the United States by the name of Thomas Smith Webb, who had been from Boston, he was initiated in New Hampshire, moves to New York, and while he's in New York, supposedly receives from one or more Englishmen the rituals of William Preston. And then supposedly, he revises those and makes them adaptable to the American mode of working. And in the process of so doing, he initiates several other people or brings in several other friends who also agree with his revised system, and they spread out from state to state. And as they go from town to town, more and more Grand Lodges ultimately adopt his ritual until by 1810, all of the New England Grand Lodges have adopted his work. By 1816 and 18 and 20, virtually every Grand Lodge that exists at that time ends up adopting his work. Until in 1828, September 11th, an individual by the name of William Morgan, who's purporting to expose one of the ritual types in New York, is claimed to be abducted, possibly murdered, and the fraternity as a whole kind of goes into a slumber, disappears for a number of years. Many Grand Lodges, over 80 to 90% of the lodges fold. The Grand Lodge of Vermont, famously, the Grand Secretary, I think the Grand Treasurer and Grand Master agree to meet either every 2 or 3 years in one of their homes. You know, they light a candle in the window. Well, I guess we met, we're still here. They extinguish the candle, go home for a couple more years, and they do that for over a decade, right? And then eventually, by 1839, 1840, in many places, the fraternity starts to come back. So they decide all of the old-timers who have known the ritual, the brand newly adopted ritual, remember, because many of these places had only recently adopted the Webb work. It's not like they had guys who'd been practicing the ritual for 45 years, according to Webb. In some cases, many of these guys had only learned it 2 or 3 years before the Morgan affair starts, right? And that's kind of important to keep in mind. We think of it in a different frame of reference now. But the story as we receive it is many Grand Lodges agree to meet in 1843, the town of Baltimore. And when they're in Baltimore, they come together, they revise those rituals, and then those rituals again become disseminated to different Grand Lodges. And those Grand Lodges largely either do or don't adopt some version of that ritual. Now, all of that, including from 1717 up until 1843, is largely BS. And I'm going to tell you that because you can follow that. Anybody, not just me, any one of you can, for the most part, everything I have, Google virtually every single one of these things. To this point, many of these documents have been scanned. There are handwritten letters that are often posted on university websites. There are colleges which have scanned whole collections of books which have proceedings which mention these things. I think that by the time I'm done finished speaking about this, I hope that many of you are encouraged to go out and investigate some of these things on your own. So, now, how do we get to why these things don't make sense? Now I'm going to talk about, just briefly again, now that we've mentioned those, we're going to cover that topic just slightly. We're going to add a little bit new information this time. So when we talk about the modern Grand Lodge from 1717, which ends in 1813, and of course there's new information that suggests possibly that Grand Lodge formed in 1721 instead of 1717. I also don't buy that, because of the formation of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients in 1751, which we don't have time to cover today. But that ritual started out, supposedly, with about a 2-degree system, right? The rituals that most people know today, the oldest known manuscript of any Masonic ritual that's published today, is from 1698. It's from Scotland, okay? And it describes roughly 2 degrees. And there's 3 or 4 other manuscripts that kind of jive with that. They are largely the same, sometimes word for word exactly the same, about 2 degrees, okay? At some point, this has at least as far as the story goes, around the 1720s, supposedly one of them might be split apart, and another couple of them added. Okay? Those don't need to detain us, but what's important at this moment is this. In 1730, the first printed exposure that most of you guys have probably heard of, Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, is published. And that is seen as a de facto ritual for the moderns, right? This essentially does describe a 3-degree system. Have a seat, guys, or look around, see if we can get somebody who's got more chairs outside to bring them in.
They're heading out now.
Yeah. So this ritual, the 1730 Masonry Dissected, is essentially the last of the moderns type that's printed in English, okay? But the moderns Grand Lodges, they've got more lodges in France that become formed and follow their essential system. They generally call it loosely a French moderns, right? What's important about that is that ritual style is very distinct, okay? You would know it anytime you read it, and I'm sure most of you have probably read it at some point or encountered it. And not only is it very distinct, but it does not match the style that we know that the ancients used. So the ancient style, they formed the Grand Lodge allegedly in 1751. And when they form, they don't form fully formed, they form by a committee. There is no Grand Master. It's a group of, I think maybe 6 guys who are running the show. And when they form in July of 1751, they decide that they do need a Grand Master, and they need to convince a nobleman or somebody who's of sufficient status, just like the moderns did. Because that's also what the Grand Lodge of Scotland ultimately did in 1736, to the point that they deliberately chose 4 lodges to found the Grand Lodge of Scotland, excluding a couple of very key ones. But you have to match it in parallel. Grand Lodge of Ireland had done a similar sort of thing, modeled themselves after a Grand Steward's Lodge, which is kind of a group of guys, a committee behind the scenes who runs the show. So this ancient Grand Lodge elects a Grand Master in 1753. But he's just the master of one of the lodges. He's just like me, he's just part of the rank and file, okay? By 1754, they're preparing the Iron Raison, which people are going to hear about later from Sean Iyer. And that's their kind of book of constitutions. They're ready to print it right before they have a Grand Master, a noble Grand Master, who comes out in 1756. Okay, so from 1751 to 1756, they're really getting going. Right off the bat, their second Grand Secretary is an individual by the name of Lawrence Dermot, whom most of you have probably heard of as well. Lawrence Dermot had moved to London from Ireland, where he'd been a Mason. Famously feisty. This is the kind of individual who everybody knew everything about. You heard of him, whether you knew him personally. I'll relate an anecdote about him that's kind of gives you an idea about his character. So he was known to describe the lecture, or the series of lectures in open Grand Lodge. If you read the minutes of the Ancients Grand Lodge, they actually state that several times the lectures were given in the Grand Lodge. Then they also later had a committee of individuals, they called them the Nine Worthies. And those Nine Worthies who had a special jewel would go out into the different districts or provinces and teach this ritual, including the Royal Arch and several other bits. But Dermot wasn't content just to lecture. He also enjoyed to sing, song. He would sing at every opportunity, and many of these guys were used to toasting and singing songs while they were involved. But he was known to do so much that it kind of aggravated several of his peers. And if you read one of the sets of minutes, it says that he had been censored for lecturing and singing the brethren to death. Now, this is the Grand Secretary, which means either he or one of his assistants had to write those, and he had to sign off on those minutes, which is a little bit more of a sting in that, and I kind of enjoy that being a Grand Secretary myself. I've been in one of those positions. I think all of us can relate to that. Dermot famously claimed that his Grand Lodge had more ritual and was twice as full as the moderns Grand Lodge. And so from 1750 to 1756, or 1751 to 1756, when they have their first noble Grand Master, they're kind of coalescing, and they're really quickly getting moving along. 1760, there's a ritual that many of you have probably heard of, 3 distinct knocks, and it claims to represent the ancients working. 1762, the more famous Jachin and Boaz, ends up being printed, and it's largely 3 distinct knocks with a little bits from a French ritual translated into English, which is basically kind of fleshing out the remainder of that ritual. And that ritual takes off like wildfire, much the way that Samuel Pritchard in 1730, his Masonry Dissected, ended up becoming extremely popular, going through multiple editions. It was a bestseller. Everybody wanted a copy because it gave you something to look at for the moderns. With the ancients, this Jacob and Boaz in 1762 takes off. Everybody has a copy, and it's printed well into the early 1800s. And in fact, you can still find copies even today, right? That ritual is completely distinct in style and tone from the modern's ritual. And yet the story is that supposedly both of them were using that. I kind of question that. There are plenty of examples, and if anybody liked them afterwards, I can go ahead and give them to you, of lodges in the north of England, in Scotland, in Ireland. And remember, Ireland and Scotland have a deep connection with this ancient Grand Lodge in London, that local lodges were actually using Jacob and Boaz in open lodge to teach members from, or people were on the sly teaching it to each other, and maybe making handwritten corrections when things deviated from what they knew. I think all of us generally have heard sort of some kind of story about all of this up until where I'm at now. From this point on, things get a little bit different in the United States. So in the United States, and I'm going to kind of generalize here, because we have a lot of things that I'd like to cover in it seems like a short amount of time to me, but I realize keeping everyone hostage for an hour is a bit difficult. So in the United States, we find ourselves in a position where, as the moderns' lodges and grand lodges sort of disappear or are absorbed with the ancients, we're left with a generally ancient style in the United States with not much organization. Many of these grand lodges form, but they don't have much connection to England, sometimes deliberately. And what ends up resulting is these lodges, as time goes on, end up in a peculiar position where many of them are no longer doing much of the ritual that they supposedly are supposed to know. And so I have several examples here that I've printed out that if anybody'd like, I again give to people here to take a look at, and I'd like to be able to give these examples to you. I don't have enough time for all of them, but I'll give you a couple that I have from memory here. In the early 1800s, as Thomas Smith Webb, who allegedly has revised William Preston's English ritual, is teaching this to these people, and they go from state to state and town to town, many of these people are encountering lectures at all for the first time. And so we run into, and I can consistently give examples from Connecticut, Kentucky, New Jersey, New York, virtually every state that exists up until the 1820s and 30s, invariably, when they first encounter these, are either doing 0 lectures or a very minimalistic, and it usually amounts to maybe a paragraph. And perhaps, when they give anything at all other than conferring the ceremony on a blindfolded candidate, afterwards they'll read from a charge out of a book. And they read from it. It's not delivered from memory. Time after time, there are accounts of gentlemen doing this. We can read this so repeatedly, in fact, that it's considered an aberration for somebody to give a charge from memory than it is rather than read. Because consistently, no one has taken the time to do that because they're told, well, you can just go find that in a book, and you just bring the book with you. And when the time comes, you read from it. We have not only minutes of lodges that say that, we have so many proceedings that reveal this, or so many biographical accounts that, like I said, that's the exception to delivered from memory, okay? When you run into these stories, you have to question, why do these stories exist, and what would we help to gain, what would we, or the people who tell them, hope to gain from them? So, one of the things people might hope to gain from some of these stories is an appeal to authority. And they say, we adapt William Preston's lectures. And for years, I didn't believe that that was actually the story that people in the early 1800s believed. When I would read what other authors had written about this, they would never give any quotes from anything like that. And I dug around and I found probably a good 12 solid references to Grand Lodges from 1808 to 1812, or Grand Lodge of Maryland, Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., several others, and they refer to the work that they receive as Prestonian. So at least at that time, they believed what they were getting from Webb's guys was Prestonian ritual. Now, the story is that, again, Webb receives the Preston ritual, but how does he get that? So you can track this, and I've done this in a series of cells in a spreadsheet, and track the stories of the first date that I hear of any story of Webb getting this, and how many people and from where. So did he receive the ritual from one person? Was it two? Was it two or more? Was it one Englishman? Was it two Englishmen? When did this story come about? And as you track the story slowly evolves, and people are either adding details as they remember them, or they're revising them to fit what they think the facts have to be. I tend to believe it's the latter, based on the revision of the dates that they say that this happened. So initially, you hear the stories, and they say, oh, sometime around 1802 to 1803 or 4, Webb receives a ritual from a couple of guys in England, and he and a couple of other people revise it. And as they repeat the story, as Masonic writers repeat it in magazines that they're talking to each other about, the story gets slowly pushed back. Maybe it's not 1803 or 4, maybe it's 1801 or 1802. Maybe it's not 1801 or 2, maybe it's 1800. And then it goes back, it's probably not necessarily Webb and a couple of other individuals revising the ritual, it just might be Webb himself. And then he gets it from one person in England who came over in 1794, 1795, and that man is supposedly named John Handler. Okay, so when you peel back the layers far enough back, you reveal one man supposedly named John Handler, who's an Irishman, who's in New York, talks to Thomas Smith Webb, who allegedly teaches Webb Preston's ritual. And that would be fantastic if Handler possibly knew that ritual. And it's very likely that he didn't. John Handler, when you contact the Grand Lodge of Ireland, didn't exist so far as their records presently show. That doesn't mean that he didn't, but so far as they're able to discover, and there's more records being sent in or digitized all the time, but you would think somebody supposedly this significant, a record would exist. United Grand Lodge of England, no record of him. The Lodge of Antiquity that William Preston was presiding over, minutes from those meetings exist. There are records of members. He doesn't appear in any of those membership lists. In fact, the first time he really appears is in New York in 1794, 95, and the presumption is that he came from England. But that presumption is taken from a letter that he writes from South Carolina in 1809, when he says he came to that place around that time. That doesn't mean that he came from England. He could have come from Ireland. He could have come from virtually any number of other locations. He could have come from Maine at that point, right? So when we start peeling back the layers of John Handler, you ask, why does Handler become crucial to the story? And it becomes crucial to the story because you need some sort of connecting link with William Preston, who never came to the United States, okay? So I won't have time to go into all of the details about Handler, but you can rest assured that as you look up the details about him, none of those stories make sense. He ends up moving to Boston in the early 1800s, moves to South Carolina, and is supposedly the first Grand Secretary of the York Rite in South Carolina, and supposedly the first master of one of the lodges there. So I had somebody go down to one of the lodges. There's 4 or 5 lodges have merged together at this point, including that lodge that he was supposedly the first master of. And they placed a couple of large marble tablets up on the wall, memorializing all of their masters. And marble is one of those things you don't really want to have to mess with if you don't have to, right? It's not exactly, retyping something on your computer here. His name appears nowhere on those membership lists. And consistently, stories that involve John Handler turn out to be either fabricated or the truth is largely stretched. But Handler isn't necessary to the story, because what's necessary to the story is to understand why Webb has to rely on William Preston. And he relies on him because Masons in any given time love tradition, we love authority, and we love things that are old, okay? And William Preston claims to belong to the oldest lodge forming the Grand Lodge of England, right? The Lodge of Antiquity, the Goose and Gridiron Lodge. And plenty of people have seen his book, Illustrations of Masonry, which people think of nowadays as a monitor, a clear text of several lectures, okay? Not all of which were actually published in a lodge or used. This becomes crucial when you understand why these things change. So from this point on, I'm going to start debunking everything I can in a quick amount of time as I can. I'm going to read from a few things here and possibly pass a few things out for a few of you who might be willing to read a couple of these pretending to be somebody, if you don't mind. So, I'll just quickly skip a couple of these things here. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how some of these lectures were not actually used before Webb, just to kind of back up here for a moment. We have a biography by a Robert Folger, who describes when Jeremy Cross, one of Webb's men, came there, that he excited the people locally, and he says, "Nothing of that kind in Masonry was then known or practiced in the state of New York." I can go over this many times. In Connecticut, when the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire and Massachusetts combined in 1805 and 6 to adopt the Webb ritual, they end up sending a man by the name of George Richards, who it is claimed had actually learned from Thomas Smith Webb, or excuse me, from William Preston. They supposedly, Connecticut Grand Master says, this mode of making, crafting, and raising, they were thoroughly satisfied with these attainments, although he much doubted whether the craft would submit to the tedious drudgery of learning lectures, whose extreme length forbade the hope of their being attained, except by gigantic memories, and which, from the nature of things difficult to attain, and still more difficult to remember, would soon be lost in the land of eternal forgetfulness. Okay? This is actually the derision that Webb and his lectures are met with consistently. And not only is it so consistently that they've not heard of these, but when we do find that they begin to be adopted, his people sort of stretch the truth. And not only do they say that William Preston taught these, but they are officially adopted by the Modern's Grand Lodge. And not only are they officially adopted, but whoever taught Webb had a certificate of authority authorizing him as a lecturer. And none of those documents seem to exist. But it does appear that a couple of the individuals involved may have been mistaken for people, such as John Hanmer, or Webb, or Preston. So George Richards, incidentally, in 1784 would have been the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. You'll recall, by 1783, England is recognizing the United States as independence, and so he claims that he had gone to England, received all the degrees that were then available, and then had come back to the United States. Richards, and not Webb, receives official authority to publish the first American edition of Preston's Monitor, okay? But Webb had published one in 1797, and this is why you notice many of the dates keep getting pushed back from 1805 to 3 to 1 to 1797 or possibly earlier, because Webb is publishing this monitor. And it's claimed that Webb must have known the ritual of Preston if he's publishing Preston's Monitor, right? The two don't follow, though. It is not necessary to have known any of the ritual. I could publish a book, and it doesn't mean that just because I've copied what somebody else wrote, that I have any access to what they did. And peculiar to Webb at this time, in the United States, had just a couple of years previously adopted a Copyright Act. And this Copyright Act was very deliberately designed to encourage piracy among English works that have been printed, and to encourage protection among American writers. And what you did with this is you deliberately would undermine the English font of knowledge. So anything published in the English language by a non-American was freely available to be copyrighted by an American. So here's all Webb had to do. Well, clearly I'm an American citizen. Clearly William Preston is an English citizen. He's got a book written in the English language. It'd be a shame if somebody put his name on it in a copyright and was able to receive the monetary reward from it. And that's what he does. And not only does he establish this copyright, because Webb has established the copyright, no one else in the United States can copyright what Webb has. Now, people today mistakenly claim, oh, copyright was fair game back then, it was a wild west country where anything went. That's not true. It's not true. You can look up all sorts of records, especially from the Library of Congress, that validate this. But more importantly, you have something that becomes primary to Webb's concern. Not only does he have a copyright on this, but in his material, he begins to include new things. And among the new things he begins to include are constitutions for higher degrees, because he's now establishing a new right, the York right, okay? And if you want to begin to establish several of these higher degree bodies, you have to purchase a copy of this book, because how else do you have a copy of the constitutions? And in fact, they required them to do so. So Webb would get a kickback, some of the royalties from every copy of a book sold. This meant that it was very encouraging for any of the people involved selling those to keep pushing the copies, because Webb would then get more money, which would encourage the growth of the organization. Other people soon realized that while Webb could get a copyright with that, they couldn't. And so to do that, you have to substantially change some sort of work to make it your own in order to receive your own copyright. And if you've read William Morgan's Exposure from 1828, any of those at the time, Light on Masonry, which adapts part of that and puts it in there, Morgan makes it quite clear that other Masonic writers changed the language slightly so that they could get their own copyright. So if you've got a paragraph and it cruises along and it might be familiar with you, then you might change the last couple of sentences, keeping the spirit, but using different language. And by doing that, you've now established your own copyright. And a couple of people have done that, and maybe they got away with that in one jurisdiction, one district. Maybe New York let somebody do that, but maybe New Jersey says, it still looks close enough to Webb's, which is really Preston's, and I'm not going to let you get away with that business. So one individual gets creative and says, how can I get a copyright? And that individual is a man by the name of Jeremy L. Cross. Cross ends up deciding that, I don't know if I can change the words enough in this, especially if I don't want to. I teach them exactly the same way every time, Webb's ritual, when I go from place to place, and I sell Webb's monitor from place to place. But what I could do is I could put pictures in there, and that would make it substantially different. And he's told that he can't take the tracing boards. We've all seen tracing boards. They're the pictures with columns on there, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, checkered pavements, ladder, sun, moon, stars, all those familiar emblems. Sometimes they'll have a second degree one, sometimes it's included into a first, maybe a ladder or another set of stairs. A third degree would often include a coffin or a skull and crossbones, other emblems. For three kind of pictures, it wasn't really considered different enough to publish. But he was told that if you had a series of these emblems and included a few new ones of your own, you could definitely acquire a copyright. And so in the 16th edition of one of his books, you read where he's reflecting back some 40 odd years later, oh yes, and his term for this is dissected. He says he dissected the tracing board emblems and just placed them apart. And that accounts for how in the United States, we end up seeing each of these individual emblems on those old charts. Many of us have seen those old 1860s lithographs, Currier and Ives style printings, Schitter's Masonic carpets, they're called sometimes. Mark, we saw one of those in variant number 6. Those sorts of things become kind of fantastically explained by Cross. And now when he goes to peddle the degrees, he's getting a kickback instead of Webb, because people are buying his monitor, Cross's True Masonic Chart. Now, I'd like to tell you that nobody so far has deviated too much from the story. We have a little bit, but where we've gone astray is understanding what exactly it is that the ritual was and why it was and how it changes. So as I began to slowly peel back some of the layers of American ritual here, I'm going to share you some information from my Grand Lodge so that if it makes you uncomfortable hearing the story about the ritual your Grand Lodge uses, you'll understand I'm talking about mine first here. My Grand Lodge from Montana was formed in January of 1866, and the third standing resolution we adopted was this: whereas attempts are being made to force upon sister Grand Lodges the institution known as the Conservators Association, contrary to and in violation of the ancient cardinal principles and regulations of our beloved order, and it goes into this long thing about this clandestine group infiltrated Grand Lodges and basically trying to force a new ritual upon them, and it bans them. It takes language from the Grand Lodge of Illinois. The third thing adopted by my Grand Lodge in 4 points is denying this particular Masonic association, right? Now, why do they do that? Because the claim has always been Webb's ritual is Preston's ritual, and therefore it's the best and most authentic. But everyone disagreed as to what that actually was. And the person who makes those claims is a guy named Rob Morris, famously known for founding the Order of the Eastern Star, several other organizations. And again, all of you have probably heard most of these stories before. But what you need to understand is there's more layers, as you should come to expect, in all of these stories. So you can ask yourself, what did Webb teach and why? And why do we get to the point where people like Rob Morris, 40, 60 years later, are trying to reestablish that? Well, I'll tell you about Thomas Smith Webb and how he actually created the ritual. So, April Fool's Day, 1795, Thomas Smith Webb initiates an individual by the name of Solomon Southwick, who later issues a work called A Solemn Warning Against Freemasonry when the Morgan Affair goes on. And he describes quite fondly Thomas Smith Webb and quite negatively most of the other Masons that he knew at the time. And he describes Freemasonry as kind of like a hoax that everyone politely agrees to and belongs to. But in that time, he refers to him as things like this. He never refers to him by name, but he refers to him by descriptors that we know that he was the master in his lodge at that time and his profession. So he refers to Webb as my Yankee friend, the paper stainer. He was a bookseller as well as a bookbinder, and could turn, in fact, so well was he gifted with the ingenuity, turn his hand to almost anything in the way of getting along through life. Whether he is privy to it or not, the reader may determine, but certain it is that before my admission, I had a hint from a worthy brother that by obtaining Jacob and Boaz, that exposure we talked about, I should get along the better with the sublimities of the craft, and was told at the same time, on the 5 points, where to procure it. And I actually bought it, the transaction being a wonderfully smart on both sides, of an honest Quaker bookseller, well known to many persons yet living in this city, who was the partner in trade of my Yankee friend and Masonic preceptor. So he's telling us that how he learned this was from this particular exposure. And where did he buy the exposure? Well, he bought it from Webb's business partner, who also sold Masonic books. And he did it on the sly. It was a guy named Spencer, and so they would essentially tell them, oh, if you'd like to learn it, here's the basis of the ritual, and you can purchase it from him around the corner, and then around the front, you practice this ritual. So he tells him, I took the grand textbook, the Alpha and Omega of the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry. I mean the Masonic masterpiece Jacob and Boaz, home to study. And he refers to this multiple times. And there's no reason to disbelieve him, as this represented an ancient style ritual that most of the lodges were then practicing. With some deviations, somebody added a few things here, subtracted a couple of things there, right? So we know that this is what's practiced at the time. He also says that it was by my brother Yankee, the paper stainer, and he worked on selling like wallpaper in addition to books and so on, who soon became, if it be not too irreverent, as well as paradoxical to say so, a burning and shining light in the dens of darkness. It was by this grand high priest, and afterwards, I believe, grand king, that I was led to obtain a glimpse of the glories, and he describes about all of the things that he had seen while he's in the lodge. And again, he repeats that he had seen these things in a book named Jacob and Boaz, which we've already all heard referred to. So, I'll give you one more quote about this, just to drive this home, so there's no uncertainty about Webb's practice of what he was teaching and why. He says, when I took the first degree, Southwick says this, principally by the aid of Jacob and Boaz, although young and very destitute in experience in the ways of the world, I felt no small degree of shame. And he continues on about, again, I had been instructed out of Jacob and Boaz in the former steps. I'm going to establish at this point, Webb definitely had this. And you can kind of track how he forms a ritual by this. You take Jacob and Boaz for the esoteric ceremonial parts, you take Webb's, or his adaptation of Preston's monitor, and kind of put them together loosely like peanut butter and jelly, and you have a ritual. Now that doesn't have the air of, I guess you could say, interest or antiquity or the appeal to authority that most of us would like, but that's essentially what happened. And when he does this, and again I have multiple quotes from many people, state after state, as they encounter this, they love it, they eat it up. Kentucky tells us repeatedly they had never seen any of these things. Let me give you one of these examples, and I'd like maybe Tim or somebody to read this real quick. You have a microphone available, Tim?
Yes.
All right. So, the reason why I'd like a couple of other people is I get tired of hearing myself at some point, and it kind of gives you the opportunity to think of someone else that might have been available at the time saying these exact words. Just that brief little highlighted portion. This is dealing with Kentucky Freemasonry.
Glasses.
Sure.
The fellowcraft degree is, however, by many lodges treated with much less respect than its intrinsic merit deserves. The second section of the lecture, a great proportion of the ceremony, are often emitted together, and the candidate is suffered to pass with only a slight acquaintance, and perhaps not at all with the peculiarities and excellencies of this beautiful degree.
Okay, so that's an individual saying he goes through the second degree, and at the end of it, he's pretty much received nothing, and he's kind of stunned by that. And we've got a couple more examples of this, also from Kentucky, where someone says, I have learned the lectures so far as I've been able to hear them with accuracy. But here's an interesting point about that. He says, the brethren here tell me, and brethren who ought to know, that they have the lectures entire, and that nothing more is to be obtained. And he says, I am convinced, however, that they must be in error, for I find in the Book of Constitutions, and the Book of Constitutions in Kentucky adapts Webb's monitor, which again is adapting part of Preston's rituals. He says that they have the lecture in the first degree consist of 3 sections, and I have received but 1. That'll tell you something. Not only did I only receive 1 out of the 3, but the 1 he receives is actually just a recapitulation of the ceremony, right? There are no lectures in that section. And he says, I find that the lecture in the second degree describes Masonry under 2 characters, operative and speculative, and introduces to us an account of the orders of architecture, the liberal arts and sciences, and many other subjects, which appear to have no more connections to the fellowcrafts degree, as I have received it, than that of the entered apprentice or master mason. Indeed, I am convinced, by an attentive study of the Book of Constitutions, there is much to be learned in the several degrees, which no one here is able to teach me. So again, these guys are adapting a ritual style that they've never seen, and it's changing things fundamentally. They're going from virtually no ritual that goes beyond an initiation of some kind to an extensive set of lectures. Now, why? Money. Webb is receiving not only kickbacks from selling this ritual and selling the Book of Constitutions, but he's instituting new chapters, new organizations. And in the process of doing so, he begins to systematically alienate several people that are out there. Now, for the most part, they eventually come back around, but not all of them do. So famously, they go to Pennsylvania, and while Webb and his friends are meeting with several of the Grand Lodge officers, they get under their skin. And the reason they do so is they're attempting to form several new organizations, such as a Grand Encampment for the Knights Templar of the United States of America. And in the process of so doing, several of the Masons in several of these jurisdictions who have no dog in this fight say, oh, that's fantastic. But the few that do say, I have a question. And the question is always, where will the money go? And let me give you an example of why this matters. The Modern's Grand Lodge, they practice a system similar to what most American lodges and Grand Lodges do today. If you're a Blue Lodge and a Grand Lodge, your annual returns only go to the Grand Lodge about the first 3 craft degrees. And if someone calls my office in Montana and says, oh, is so-and-so a member of the Scottish Rite? I say, well, let me give you the phone number for a secretary over there. If somebody asks about the shrine, I say, well, they're not ours. I'll give you some information about one of them. And that's the modern style method of doing things. Their Grand Secretary in 1766 describes how we don't belong to that sort of thing. And it doesn't mean that they don't have this, because he says the ancients do, because he was a member of the Royal Arch. He's saying that's not ours. And consistently, the Modern's Grand Lodge tells their lodges, don't record the minutes and the proceedings of higher degrees in your lodge minutes, because they don't belong to you, right? You need to have a different set of systems and structures and administrative policies that will govern those bodies. But the ancients allowed their lodges, if they have a charter or warrant, and they have a sufficient number of brothers who are familiar with those degrees and those rituals to perform them. And when they do so, something interesting begins to happen. There are prerequisites to get some of the higher degrees, and those prerequisites often have monetary barriers. So in Pennsylvania, in order to receive a Royal Arch degree, you have to have been a past master. And not everybody at the time had been passing the chairs, they called it, becoming a past master. But for a fee of $10, you could get a dispensation from the Grand Master to make you an honorary or virtual past master. And $10 in 1808 would go a long way. And hundreds of people were applying for this. Not only that, but the Grand Lodge in Pennsylvania at the time extracted extra per capita from each of the lodges for all of those high degree members. So now here's what happens if you're Thomas Smith Webb and all of these guys teaching Webb's ritual, which is claimed to be Preston's ritual. You're telling the people who are administrating this organization, I'm going to cut out your profits, because if you don't collect extra per capita, how do you operate? I'm going to cut off the profits of the Grand Master, who's making a kickback on every one of these dispensations granted. I'm going to cut into the profits of the Grand Secretary even, because every charter given or every certificate issued has a stamp that's put on it, a seal, which is usually issued at 50 cents a pop, which again is a significant amount when you're doing a lot of those things repeatedly. And if you're in the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, you have to ask yourself, why would I do this? Our lodges can already do that. You're telling us you'd like us to give up a power that we already have and give that to you, and then you guys get the profits. And repeatedly, Pennsylvania and Thomas Smith Webb get into these arguments. And it gets quite heated, quite disgusting. The language used is foul and therefore exciting to read. And multiple times, Webb's disciples kind of miss the boat. They are not able to properly read the room. So I'm going to read you an extract of a letter from July 31st, 1816, from Jeremy Cross, who's one of Webb's members, who's teaching these rituals, to a guy named John Snow, another one of Webb's friends. And he had just met with the Grand Master and several brothers in Philadelphia. So I'll pass this out to others who'd like to see a copy of it, the actual handwritten thing, but I'm going to read from a bit of it right now. Perhaps. Oh. No, it's okay. I actually have a copy of it on the computer as well. So, we end up in this position where he refers to, let me find it here. He refers to the Grand Master as His Royal Highness. Okay? Now, if you'd like to refer to somebody in terms that might be potentially denigrating, you can overinflate their status. And at the time, this would definitely mean something to refer to someone as His Royal Highness, because they knew the correct term would have been either right worshipful or most worshipful, depending on jurisdiction. And he would have had no mistake about what that was, having just been introduced to all these gentlemen. And when he's talking about this, he tells Snow that they're recalcitrant. They don't want to change this, and essentially says that, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know if we're going to change these guys' minds anyway, so let's kind of move on. But he uses several words and terms that are disparaging. He's not the only one. Henry Foley. So in addition to Cross referring to him as His Royal Highness, we have a man by the name of Henry Foley out of Massachusetts who also worked with Thomas Smith Webb. Foley ends up telling people years later in a biography about a Knights Templar degree he witnessed in Pennsylvania, and he says, oh yeah, at the end of it, if they hadn't told me I'd witnessed a Knights Templar degree, I wouldn't have believed it. Meaning that basically they were using some crazy, who knows what, and he just said, oh, they're just fools, they don't know what they're doing. Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, one of the members says, I got a question. Where did Thomas Smith Webb receive his Knights Templar degrees? In Philadelphia, right? And then the moment it should dawn on you, oh, he knew their ritual, and it means if he had something different from what they had, he had revised something. And repeatedly he does so. We have consistent stories of Webb taking bits from Scottish Rite degrees, which are now becoming competition for Webb, so to speak, and adapting them into his York Rite system. Repeatedly. There are letters from Webb's friends to each other and back and forth with Webb describing this process, and several Grand Lodges fully aware of this. And the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania repeatedly rejects Webb's appeals for exactly that reason. In fact, they state that Webb takes material from time periods that are incongruent. They don't match, and plants them in other degrees. And they say, why would we practice that degree? Clearly that event is 900 years apart from this one here. It doesn't match. It doesn't make sense. So, fast forward to the Baltimore Convention where things are being revised. Fast forward to, oh, interesting, my internet just went out, which changes, I had called up on the screen several different quotes, which are no longer available. I'll get to it later, I'm not worried about it. So, the conservators, I'm gonna wrap up with this, and this is kind of interesting because once I finish with the conservators, I'll give you a brief overview of what Thomas Smith Webb actually may have had from Preston. So the conservators, remember I told you about Rob Morris, and he establishes after the Baltimore Convention, allegedly Webb's ritual. Morris tells everybody that I received from a man in Vermont named Samuel Wilson, Wilson with two L's, W-I-L-L-S-O-N, a particular handwritten ritual. And that ritual was written in December of 1818 and January of 1819 with the aid of a man by the name of John Barney, who allegedly learns it from Webb. And he actually didn't. He learned it from two other friends of Webb and then rehearsed it in front of Webb later. But when Morris went to Samuel Wilson's place in Vermont, Wilson's actual copy of that ritual was not present in Vermont. It was in Galveston, Texas, with the son of one of the Grand Masters, P.C. Tucker Jr. Okay, so Morris acquires from Wilson a copy. And Wilson had multiple copies because he would sell them to people and make a profit off of them. And in the process of doing so, he makes surreptitiously a copy of his own. He doesn't tell Wilson he's going to do this. Now the copy that Morris made his own copy of was missing a couple of pages and had some mistakes. And in making further copies, Morris made some of his own mistakes. Okay, this is around 1755, 6, 7. He's making many changes to these rituals. And Morris is on his way to become Grand Master in Kentucky himself. What he doesn't tell anybody, or he doesn't tell Wilson initially, is that he, along with another individual by the name of Elisha D. Cook, is going to, or Elisha, depending on how you like to pronounce it at the time, is going to create a clandestine movement called the Conservators of Masonry, with himself at the head, the chief conservator. And each lodge would have a conservator in the lodge, and they could appoint 2 deputies. And their job was to infiltrate each Grand Lodge and ultimately Grand Lodge officers and ask the Grand Lodge to adopt their ritual, because their ritual is the closest to Thomas Smith Webb's. And in so doing, he prints this ritual called the Mnemonics. And most of you have probably heard of it or seen it, but it's not necessarily correct, because as Wilson later tells everybody, after the exposure of Morris's shenanigans goes on, he says, it turns out Morris couldn't really read the cipher when he left my house in Vermont, and when he's telling this story, I don't think he can actually read it now. So then you go, is the word instrument of office or implement of office? Pay the craft their wages if any be due, or if ought be due, A-U-G-H-T. Between sucketh and zarthen, sucketh or zaraditha, you have this series of things with multiple letters that can be interpreted multiple different ways. Morris has 0 clue. And he's winging it as he goes along. He says, that letter fits. Is it oath or obligation? In some jurisdictions, they said it's oath and obligation because we can't figure out which one fits, right? This becomes a cascading series of events, and Morris becomes systematically exposed. And this is very pertinent to your jurisdictions out here because the Grand Secretary out of Illinois, a man by the name of Harmon Reynolds, discovers this. And in the course of his discovery, he realizes, I wish some of these quotes were up on the screen here right now. He realizes that Morris has been not only telling a fiction, but his Grand Master bought into it and will ask the Grand Lodge to go along with it. And I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to kind of fast forward here into some of the events that happened. Harmon Reynolds, that Grand Secretary, realizes that he wants to resist. I'm not going to take that ritual because I know a different Webb one that's more authentic, the one that we were taught by John Barney himself in 1844, the year after the Baltimore Convention. Okay. The Grand Master sends 3 henchmen to Harmon Reynolds' Grand Secretary's office to retrieve all the books, papers, memorabilia, stamps of authority, and everything. And in the process of going to seize those items, Reynolds says, I kind of think they're mine. I was legitimately elected. The Grand Master can't depose me, and I reject your claim. They get into literally a tug and pull match of like who's got the seal for the Grand Lodge, and they're fighting with each other. And eventually Reynolds says, okay, you know what, guys? Hang on a moment. I'll get you the stuff. Wait right here. Goes back to his office, shuts the door, locks the door. They're on the outside, and who couldn't see this coming? Then he throws open the window behind himself, and I'm not making this up, screams murder out to the street below. The sheriff is called, they come in, knocking, what's going on? The sheriff says, and by this time, several reinforcements have come by to take out Harmon from the office physically, right? The sheriff says, hey, do you want to press charges? Reynolds says, I'm not really sure about that. We're kind of outnumbered here. So a few more people show up. Eventually, they're kind of confident that things aren't going to get too hairy. And he says, nah, I think we're good. But in the meantime, this situation continues to grow as they're trying to resolve this. And eventually goes to court, like civil court, right? And Reynolds ends up in a court case with the Grand Lodge of Illinois over who's authentically installed. And this is the sort of thing that Morris agitates for everywhere. Publicly, in his magazines, he says, oh, we don't advocate the overthrow of Grand Lodges. Privately, and there are so many letters that attest to this, I have to believe they're all true. Person after person says, Morris told me, oh no, we're going to have to get rid of this guy. No, this is what we actually do. Please keep this confidential. Oh, I hope you don't expose my plan to these guys over here. And that's probably actually what happened. But he's not the only one who ends up in this boat. The Grand Secretary of Michigan is also in this boat. And the Grand Secretary of Michigan also received the degrees of Barney in 1844 when he was a brand new Mason. And he also has a handwritten cipher. And he says, nope, that doesn't jive, etc. And he ends up telling people in this oration in 1863, before the Grand Lodge and before several members, Morris is selling his mnemonics book for $10 a pop. Now, if you take one conservator in each of our lodges and 2 deputies, you come up with quite a few people. But if you end up adopting his ritual, you've got 7,000 members coming out to effect $70,000 to adopt this ritual, which comes out to about $250,000 in today's money. And he exposes this and says, not only is that not the ritual, because I have handwritten copies that exist and predate this, but you're giving your authority to somebody else here. And the language becomes unflattering. He describes him as, and several people do, as the American Cagliostro. Cagliostro was this faux count, Giuseppe Balsamo, supposed charlatan, etc. Thomas Smith Webb had been described with the same language, the Prince of Impostors, from the guys from Pennsylvania, right? This is the ritual system that we get. So I'm going to wrap this up with, what is the ritual system of Preston and how widespread was it? The answer is probably not very widespread at all. Many people had purchased his monitor, his Illustrations of Masonry. Preston in 1772 throws a gala before the Grand Lodge, and he gives several orations. People like what he has to say so much, you should print that. He goes, you're right, I should print that. So he does. And it involves things that become part of a first degree. 2 years later, he prints things that involve a second and third degree. And within about 4 years of that, by 1778, he's on his way to being expelled. Okay? 1779, he's definitely out. He forms that new Grand Lodge. But interestingly, with that new Grand Lodge, he only forms 2 subordinate lodges. And the first Grand Lodge doesn't even practice his ritual. The first lodge doesn't practice his ritual. Only lodge number 2 does. And he's the deputy master of that. But after a couple of years, he famously demits from that lodge as well. And he kind of disappears, right? And then he revises a number of years later, about 10 years later, another ritual, and comes back into that Grand Lodge. So how widespread was that lodge and that ritual of that lodge? Probably not very much, because if you look from 1730 up until 1813, there are no manuscript rituals that represent the modern style rituals, right? But the ancients have Jachin and Boaz from 1762. Separately though, the moderns, while they don't have a cipher ritual or esoteric bit, repeatedly issue multiple monitors. Preston's not the only one. Calcutt, Hutchinson, Truman, several people issue these with official sanctions from the Grand Lodge repeatedly. And their ritual, by the time of 1813, issued by the Grand Stewards Lodge, the group of men running that modern's Grand Lodge, so far outstrips the ancients' ritual that they've dwarfed them. Like if you read Finch and Brown, who published some of Preston's rituals, you'll find that the language of the ancients is kind of, it's pedestrian. It appears kind of average, and that's because it hasn't really been evolved much. So you run into this question: what would Webb have gotten, and from whom? How many people actually practiced it? The answer is not many. There's like maybe 89 names assigned to Preston's Lodge over a number of years. Now there would have been a number of other people who visited, but that's not a large number of people. Just like in the Ancients Grand Register, the number of people who are recorded having the Royal Arch degree, even though they write that in there, is only like 37, 39 names. Now there probably would have been more people, but not a whole lot, even when you account for records being missing and so on. And what you come down to is this: Preston himself was quite well known. His ritual was legendary, but virtually nobody had seen it. And there's not really much evidence that the Grand Lodge had adopted it initially. But there is some suggestion that in the 1790s, his ritual may have been adapted by the Grand Stewards Lodge, semi-officially by the Grand Lodge, to kind of bring something to the table in 1813 when they merged with the ancients. So I'll wrap up with this, because this is a brief overview, and I'd love to go into more detail. We're at 9:00, I guess this thing is, I'm on the wrong time zone here, but I'd like to say that as far as the ritual goes, you have the ability, and all of us have the ability, to essentially question, where did that come from? So, actually, now I guess I should beg your indulgence. I thought I was going to wrap up because I just see that even though I am on the wrong time zone here, I'd still have potentially another 20 minutes. So if anybody's interested, I'd like to share a little bit of Preston's ritual. Not much, because you can overstay the welcome up here. It's pretty easy. Give me just a moment. So, I'm going to share a little bit with you from William Preston's ritual. And I discovered one of his rituals out of New York just a couple of years back. And I contact the Grand Lodge in New York, Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Library, and I say, what's the oldest manuscript handwritten ritual that you have in your collection? I'm just kind of curious. And the woman who answers the phone, she says, oh, it's from 1739. Now my thought initially is, well, there's only two possibilities as to why that's not possible, because it isn't possible in theory. One is, because I know each of the rituals that have been published so far. We have some from 1723, 1727, 1730. None of the English language rituals have a date of 1739, okay? So either it's one that's previously unknown and unpublished, or the date is wrong. And in either case, I want to know why. So I have them take pictures of it and send it over to me. And I immediately realized from the very first sentence, this is not the ancients' procedure, which is the basis of American ritual, that ciphered part, and then the monitor adopted from Preston, but it is clearly Preston's ritual. And as you filter through there, you actually see Preston's name in there. When Preston gave his ritual, and when his lodge people gave the ritual, it was a series of individuals who would do it. You would take one section, you would take the second section, you might take part of section 3, and he would finish section 3, right? And Preston's name appears in part of that. We can begin to start dating this manuscript by several dates that are in there. And why does it have the date of 1739? Because this ritual belonged to Royal Naval Lodge number 57, which had been under dispensation in 1738 and received its charter in January 1739. And somebody had written that on the title page, 1739, because it's the Royal Naval Lodge's ritual, which they actually call the Freemasons' Compendium, right? This ritual contains the fullest, the most complete known version of William Preston's ritual written out anywhere. There's no lodge in England. The United Grand Lodge Library, Freemasons Hall, does not have a more complete copy. The Lodge of Antiquity, Quattuor Coronati Lodge, nobody has a more complete copy of that first degree. So I transcribed the entire copy of that, which also has the second degree that matched the ancient style. If you'd like to get an opportunity to read what William Preston's ritual was, that's supposedly Webb adapted, pick up a copy of the Scottish Rite Research Society's Heirdom from a year ago, volume 25, and I transcribed the entire thing, and it's in there. It's a few hundred pages. It's fantastic. It's bloated language, overloaded. You would recognize a lot of it even today. And the fantastic thing is very few people, even in Preston's Lodge, did the entire thing. You wouldn't do the entire degree when you showed up. You might do a part of a degree, but you would never give all of the lecture of the first degree in one sitting. It's too long. Even in Preston's time, people weren't doing it. And there are records to attest to that. They'd say we gave section 4 tonight, maybe another week they give section 7, 8, and 9. But usually they would never give the entire thing. And yes, there's that many, up to 12 sections at times. Preston's ritual follows the modern style. And I might be going a little too far here, and if I'm boring you, feel free to check your cell phone. I understand, I bore myself sometimes with this. But the Modern's Grand Lodge, their ritual style is arbitrary. They essentially do this. We've got an entire ritual, and they hack up bits and pieces just for slices to be memorized. Not because it makes sense, not because, well, naturally these sections go together. They just go, I'm going to cut it right here, and then the next section might begin, and it might be a part of the section that preceded it, what you perceive to be. It might be related to it, but they get done with it. I will go to the next section. And it's been that way since the 1730s when you read Masonry Dissected. But Jacob and Boaz, which the second and third degrees that are attached to this manuscript, is in another style completely. And every one of us will recognize this style. So in the United States, the first degree would traditionally be in 3 parts, their lectures. Now some Grand Lodges only give 2 parts of that, or maybe even only 1, but traditionally it's from 3 parts. The first section would be a long-form catechism. Everybody's heard of that, or has at least done something with that. A question and answer. And with that catechism, you can recreate that ceremony, that degree. The second section would be a series of question and answers again, or given in a narrative format, but it explains all of that, right? You did A because of B, you did C because of D. So it's the same thing, but with fuller explanations. And then the third section involves things like the forms, supports, coverings, furniture, ornaments, lights, jewels of a lodge, how it is situated, to whom dedicated, right? And that would be the traditional tracing board lecture with a few American bits thrown in there. That's exactly the ancient style. And all Webb does is adapt that and kind of cut and paste to fit things in there. And none of that matches the modern style exactly, or even really at all. So, I would encourage all of you, if you're interested in seeing Preston's ritual, to look up that in the Heirdom volume number 25. You can read it. There are others out there, but this one's the most complete out there. And it has things that nobody had. And I have to tell you, you have to really want to read it, because not only is it really long, but the language, as you know, if you read any of the long bits in the ritual parts, in the US today, they could be a bit much. You talk about the whale, and it goes off and, or the sense of smell, and it can go off for what would be a couple of paragraphs, and you kind of have to want to read it. So I'm just going to tell you now, if you don't, that's okay too. But what you should take away from this is this. Very few people in England would have seen it. Very few people would have used it. It probably wasn't officially adopted. And even if it had been, it would have only been adapted at the end of the time of the moderns, right before their union. Now, what makes this manuscript that I discovered different? And when I say discovered, it was sitting there. I'm not somebody who went through some catacomb, brushing away cobwebs and with a bullwhip and doing these kinds of things. It was sitting inside some library for years. They just hadn't cataloged it correctly, and nobody knew what they were looking at. But it sounds better when you say that you discover something like that, right? We all want to think like that. Here's what happens when you look at it, though. And you put it in that perspective. Not only could anybody have done that, but anybody could have discovered that that particular lodge was different. Royal Naval Lodge 57 is the linchpin as to why the ancients and moderns, I'm lecturing all of you to death today. That Grand Secretary dies. He'd been a force to be reckoned with. And when he dies, it kind of sets the stage for this. And a couple of the Grand Masters from each side look at each other and say, we really want this union to happen. But there's a catch. The master of Royal Naval Lodge happens to be in a dispute with the man who's the Grand Secretary of one of the lodges and Deputy Grand Master of the other Grand Lodge. But it's the same guy, right? So Thomas Harper is Grand Secretary for one of the Grand Lodges and Deputy Grand Master, meaning the acting Grand Master, for the other Grand Lodge. Now how would that be? Because allegedly you can't be a member of both. One is clandestine, we don't like each other, let's get angry. There was a bunch of these guys from several key lodges that belonged to both Grand Lodges. Especially among the moderns, several of their members who belonged to the Grand Stewards Lodge. And the Grand Stewards Lodge was kind of the committee that behind the scenes ran the Grand Lodge. To be eligible for election as a Grand Lodge officer, you had to be a member of the Grand Stewards Lodge. And only a dozen or so lodges were culled from to make those members happen, right? Several of those key lodges had members who consistently belonged in ancients' lodges. So here's what the master of Royal Naval Lodge 57 says. He says, you do know Harper belongs to the bad guys over there. And they're always like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And he brings it up a couple more times because he's in a personal dispute with them. And he brings it up so forcefully that a committee has to be formed to investigate it and say, all right, we kind of were hoping this would go away. Nobody'd have to address this. But he pushes the issue. So they say to Harper, oh, yeah, it turns out maybe you belong to the ancients over there. And it's like, maybe. And they keep trying to push this committee. I think it goes over a series of over a year and a half of, if we just maybe bury this, it'll go away. That's the hope of the committee. That's the hope of Harper and several people involved. Yeah, maybe. I guess I belong over there. And if we just don't ask enough questions, it'll go away. Because they all want to merge together at this point. But the master of this lodge, Royal Naval Lodge, Firebrace C. Daniel, F.C. Daniel, won't let this go. And it comes to a head. And in the process of it, Harper ends up having to leave membership in one of the Grand Lodges, and the whole thing falls apart. And the merger doesn't take place. But F.C. Daniel does the same thing in his lodge that Preston does. Kind of alienates several other people, and he takes his lodge and they go rogue. They separate from the Grand Lodge and become the Independent Royal Naval Lodge, or Royal Naval Lodge of Independence. And a grandiose title that means pretty much nothing. So they issue new certificates, they cross out the old ones and issue them out there. And in the process of so doing, I believe that's when this manuscript is created. And he takes some of Preston's ritual, and it's handwritten, and it's given in the format of a book, exactly the way you would give it to a printer or a bookbinder if they were going to publish that. Laid out exactly the same way, to the page number, the index involved, and so on. It had to have been written based on internal evidence between probably 1806 and 1809, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what both Grand Lodges were probably working. And shortly after this dispute ends, then the Grand Lodges say, okay, well, we put that behind us. Harper's okay? Everyone goes, yep, I guess Harper's okay. Daniel, you give up your claim? Yeah, I guess I give up my claim. And the merger starts to happen. And at the same time this is going on, the United States is trying to figure out, what are we going to do for our ritual? And what are we doing? We have a guy named Thomas Smith Webb who says, have I got a ritual for you? And it belongs to the most well-known Mason in England. And we buy it, hook, line, and sinker. So, now, I could go into individual detail as to why separate Grand Lodges adopted the versions that they did, but I don't want to go too far into that now. What I'm going to end with is this. I have copies of virtually any of these rituals that anybody was using. If any of you'd like to see, letters, manuscripts, etc. Eventually, maybe this will come out in a book. I don't know. I don't really have the time for that, but that will probably come out. And I'll tell you how accurately we know some of these things. I've seen the Samuel Wilson manuscript from 1817 when Webb was still alive. It still exists. I know that because I contacted a past Grand Master out of Vermont who I'm friends with and said, anybody happen to see that? They go, yeah, I don't think anybody's seen it since the 1860s when Iowa sent a delegation led by a guy named Langridge out there to make a copy of it. And it had been sitting in a garage behind the Grand Lodge building, gathering mold with a few other books in several boxes out there. It just sat out there. So they collect the book, several other manuscripts, put them in a safety deposit box, and just leave them there for years. I paid them a little bit of money to scan copies of that, and I took a look at them. And it turns out they're kind of interesting. And they had several other ritual manuscripts I've taken a look at as well. But they're not the only jurisdiction that you can find these things for. So when we talk about what's the Baltimore Convention ritual from 1843 that supposedly nobody adopts or there's an argument about it, why is there an argument about who adopts it and what it is? That's another personal dispute that comes about between the Grand Secretary of Massachusetts and the Grand Secretary of Virginia, because they're publishing competing versions of monitors following the convention. 3 people from the Baltimore Convention are tasked with the purpose of creating a monitor to match the Baltimore Convention work. 2 of them go along and publish it, largely led by one guy, Charles Whitlock Moore, C.W. Moore out of Massachusetts, famous for publishing a couple of magazines. Everybody kind of knew who this guy was. He's kind of like the Parvin of Iowa. He's that equivalent over there in Massachusetts. Publishes a monitor. But what the guys in Virginia don't like is the monitors got too much clear English text, because they didn't like that in the first place. And we know they didn't because in the 1820s, their Grand Secretary from the 1840s was a brand new Mason, wet behind the ears, and he's the guy who led the charge to adapt and adopt the Webb work. You can read the paper, anybody can. And he tells the story about how they convinced the Grand Lodge to adopt that work. And in the process, they contact a Mason named Jeremy Cross, and we've all heard that story, and I mentioned it earlier. But here's the interesting thing about how that happens. When they contacted Cross, all they wanted him to do was send him several miniature tracing boards, pocket tracing boards, so someone could carry them in a back pocket, a breast pocket, jacket pocket somewhere, and then just display them and teach from that, either a candidate one-on-one or in a degree. But they find out something different. When they've ordered 200 copies of his work, and it comes sight unseen, and they open the boxes and they're excited and they start passing them out, oops, not only has he dissected the emblems, but it's got the monitor in there. You gasp, we have ritual in clear English. These guys don't want that. They want nothing to do with that. And they never did want anything to do with that at that time. So they try not to adopt it. They managed to somehow convince the Grand Lodge to accept that ritual, to adopt the ritual. So when the Baltimore Convention monitor is going to be published, here's the problem that Dove says. You know, the thing's got too much clear English, and we haven't wanted that in 20 years, so that thing's wrong. People buy it up though, and it's making profit hand over fist. So what's Dove do? And you can read about this in the back of it. He's got this biographical detail describing several things. It's long and probably as rambling as I am, so you'd have to really dig to find it. But here's what he says, essentially. If you can't beat him, join him. And if he's going to make money off of it, I guess we're going to make money off of it, and we're going to issue our own competing one. And he does. Dove's Masonic textbook, right? So the story with the Baltimore Convention about who knows, 1844, you'll recall I was telling you that the Grand Secretary out of Michigan, who exposes Rob Morris, he says, it's kind of funny what Morris is claiming the ritual is, because I remember it. And you know how he remembers it? Because right after the Baltimore Convention of 1843, John Barney, who had been a contemporary of Thomas Smith Webb's, Barney had supposedly taught Wilson, who teaches Morris and language in Iowa and so on, right? Okay. Barney comes to Michigan, and he teaches this lodge, the oldest chartered lodge when the Grand Lodge of Michigan is reformed, then called Detroit No. 1. He teaches a brand new entered apprentice, like a week after they form. They say, would you stay here for a while? Yeah, sure. And he teaches them, and they all write it down on a handwritten cipher manuscript, right? Copies of some of those still exist. I have seen personally one from the 1880s, that's a direct copy of that one from the 1840s by their Grand Secretary Fenton. We know what he wrote, but he's not the only one. We can recreate the situation in Illinois and several places consistently. So when people say we don't know where it comes from, we don't know how it happened, what they might mean is I don't know where it came from and I don't know what happened. But that isn't necessarily the case. And consistently, the story is usually you can follow the money. Somebody, somewhere, is getting a kickback from it. And the ultimate result is this. People end up saying, well, if it's all made up, maybe it doesn't mean anything. And I say the takeaway from this needs to be this. All of us feel, I think, or I like to believe, the same sense of obligation. And the ritual and the ceremonies are sufficiently stirring and moving to cause all of us at some point to go beyond what we would normally do. It excites people into doing things that not only would they not do, but as a group that they couldn't do, that they would do as a group that they couldn't do individually. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And we're not the only place that does that. You could do this with every ritual and every jurisdiction out there and track who does this and why. So, I'll wrap this up because now I really am near the end of my hour time and I am kind of tired of hearing myself speak. I'll give you one more example, and it's a non-American example. The Grand Lodge of Ireland. They claim, or many of their members have claimed, to have the oldest unbroken ritual chain going back to 1725. Their Grand Secretary Spratt from the 1740s, who teaches another Grand Secretary named Fowler, who had been the Deputy Grand Master, the de facto Grand Master essentially, running the Grand Lodge when it's not in session. But here's an interesting claim about that. They would have been using an ancient style ritual, Deacon and Boaz, right? Anyone who's seen the Irish ritual would plainly go, doesn't really make sense. In fact, it looks quite familiar. It looks very much like the United Grand Lodge of England's post-1813 ritual. Well, there's a reason for that. Fowler went to London and learned the ritual of the United Grand Lodge of England. Not only did he do that, and he'd gone there, but the Grand Lodge of Ireland officially adopts that. And so 1814, 1816, 1817, 1819, you can repeatedly learn that the Grand Lodge of Ireland is sending delegates throughout Ireland to local lodges and reteaching them the new version of the ritual. And it is definitely a new ritual because the lectures that they use, and not all of them choose to give the lectures. Even today in many English lodges, they won't give the tracing board lectures, they'll usually just give the ceremonies. The lectures are modeled not after the ancients, like everyone claims, but after the moderns. And you know that because you can tell word for word where they got them from either William Preston or several friends of his later, okay? 1725, 1744, 1790, it's not unbroken. Ireland did the same thing. England has done the same thing, and you can do this with rituals all over the world. Every ritual, there is no unbroken chain. And not only is there no unbroken chain, we usually know the individuals involved there, right? So, I'd like to, at least for a moment, finish with that. Do I have any questions? Yes.
So first of all, thank you. That was incredible. As you're going through this, Robert Johnson, Grand Lodge, Illinois. As you're going through this, it really seems as though Preston is the progenitor of this system, and what you outlined is a series of guys who kind of made a buck off the back of another guy. And, you know, there's Masonic lessons, I guess, to be learned there, but in your opinion, where is Preston like the original? Where is your research led you in any directions to state like where maybe Preston had received some of the things that he wrote down? As you're going through this, I joked with my State Education Officer Scott, I don't know if you guys have seen Spaceballs, but at the end he says, we'll all meet in Spaceballs Part 2, the search for more money. And it kind of seems like these guys just continue to do, you know, just looking for a way to make a buck off the craft. So where does Preston get his stuff from, or is it just, come to them?
Yeah, sure. So, it's kind of there are 2 or 3 answers to that, because it's not just one thing that comes to be Preston. So the first is, Preston later claims, and he tells people repeatedly, that he went out on a search, and he found as many old Masons or as many old rituals as he could find, and then he kind of compiles them into this hybrid ritual of his that he improves upon. That's at least his story. The story that we all tell, because we want to romanticize it, is that not only did he improve on it, but it was the official Grand Lodge of the Moderns ritual, the premier Grand Lodge. Now, if it was, show me the minutes, right? Show me the minutes. Now, that statement is based on this. In the front of his book, if you open it up, they have a copyright, and then, well, not a copyright, but a dedication page. And it's dedicated, and it's given, it actually says sanction, right? And it's given under the sanction of the Grand Lodge. And they go, well, apparently the Grand Lodge officially endorsed his monitor, therefore it officially endorsed his ritual. But I don't think the one necessarily follows the other. And I'll tell you why. He's not the only one who has an official sanction. Robert Truman issued a book called The Principles of Freemasonry Delineated, and he also has a sanction in the front of his book by a district Grand Master out of the Moderns Grand Lodge. And he's not the only one. Repeatedly, the Moderns have several of these monitors, and they have a sanction, and it lists somebody, either the Grand Master or a district deputy, a district Grand Master, and a sanction. So if Preston's authorized, then naturally the rest of them are authorized as well, right? I think what they're getting at is essentially, well, nothing they've done is wrong, and if you like, you can freely use something of that, right? So where does Preston get his? Here's the trick. Who knows what Preston had? Up until 1969, when a gentleman named Percy R. James, P.R. James, prints in clear English for the first time in Quattro Coronati's transactions, AQC, the first degree, virtually nobody had seen it since 1839 or so on, when the last person giving his ritual had disappeared, right? Okay, so if nobody's seen it in 100 years, we don't even know what it is, and that's the first time it actually appears in print. And then in the second degree, I think in 1970, and the third degree in 72, I believe. But here's how P.R. James came about with it. When Preston taught the ritual, and this is going to kind of, I hope when I coalesce around this in the next 2 minutes, I'll finish answering that question. P.R. James takes manuscript notes and little bits of printed things, and he compiles them all together. So kind of like I've got this mess of papers behind me, he gets as many of these different bits of Preston work together, and he cobbles together like Frankenstein's monster. I'll get a leg here, and I get an arm here, and here's the head, right? Okay, that's Preston's ritual, because they're missing all these bits, and he forms it. And it looks good, so it sounds complete, so it's got to be right. In 1986, 85, 86, another gentleman named Colin Dyer publishes a more complete one, and he tries to take as much as possible from only one ritual manuscript source apiece, because that seems more authentic. It was learned by the guys sitting at the table all that same day or so on, right? Okay. There's not many of these. There's so few of these out there that, like I said, I discovered the most complete one that's out there, and nobody in England has a copy of that. And there's so few of these things out there that you have to ask, why are there so few of these if this is the most adopted and the most well-known? Well, the answer is William Preston again. If he's, let me rephrase this. Let me back up. If Preston's ritual is supposed to be adopted, by whom? So remember, 1772, much like this, the Grand Lodge is all assembled. There's like this orchestra in the corner. There are people serving food. People who have been deputized as entered apprentices so they can serve food. The Grand Master and his entourage are all here. Like myself, he's giving this oration, and everybody's like, fantastic, bravo, I really like that, you should publish it. And again, he's like, yeah, of course I should. And of course, when you publish it, you're getting some money from it, right? So, but he doesn't publish the ritual. We all claim that he does. What he published was a series of lectures that he adapted from other people. Charles Leslie's 1743 Vindication of Masonry, parts of which become the G lecture. Geometry, the first and noblest of sciences, right? Okay, so Preston is just kind of repeating a bunch of these things, and they're not set ritual bits yet. All he's got is a series of lectures,
And the lectures are just orations. He's just giving a speech, an address. By 1744, he's revised Fellowcraft and Master Mason a little bit. By 1777 and 78, it's clear he's already cheesed off enough of the leadership. He's going to be out one way or the other. And by 1779, he's evicted. How long does the Grand Lodge have to adopt his ritual? How long did it take him to write it? And he'd only been a Mason for a few years when he does this. He only comes in the 1760s, right? Okay, so, and then he's gone for like a dozen years, out in the wilderness. He even demits from his own Grand Lodge, you know? Oh, that pissed me off too, I'm gone. Okay, where did he get the information and what? Which ritual even? Because we talk about Preston as if there's one Preston ritual, and he did create one, but then while he's gone, he creates a second ritual type from the Order of Herodin. And he takes some of these high degrees and cobbles them together, creates his own system. Now when he comes back, I think that's the ritual type that we're all thinking that Preston actually had a ritual, okay? At that point, he has a little bit of something which is modified by the Grand Steward's Lodge and maybe is used because it's a showpiece. And here's where I think, to sum up the answer, that Preston got whatever he had. People forget that Preston worked in the book industry. He was an editor and a bookbinder and publisher, and he had been a Scottish man who'd come down to London, and he works for Strahan. Strahan had been the king's printer, right? And Preston also works in the Grand Secretary's office as the Deputy Grand Secretary. And while he's editing all of these books, he's picking up information. So people famously refer to Preston for some sort of advice. What would you do if you were to write this paragraph? And he edits everybody. Famously, Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Preston, you know, he's got a great style, and he's like, would you kind of edit my work? Sure. Burke, the Scottish philosopher, there's a line directly out of Burke that appears in his ritual, slightly changed, but it's Burke. Unmistakably, if you've ever read Burke, you would know that. Preston just has everything in front of him, and he just kind of takes the bits that he likes, and he essentially says, I want to share these with people. And I don't think he ever intended for every single lodge to adopt that. You couldn't have, because like I said, it was too long. There's too many sections, and they're arbitrarily hacked up, and you're not giving every one of them at every meeting. And who can memorize that much? Even Preston probably himself did not. None of the manuscripts that exist tell the exact same story. Some of them say it slightly differently. They'll give you the same story, but you know, is it this or is it that? Well, you know, he's probably ad-libbing slightly as he goes. Kind of like I ad-libbed a little bit of this as I went to adapt to the format, right? Okay, so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, to answer your question, that Preston did gather other materials, he did edit something, but it's not a one-and-done thing. You have to say, what did he gather, at what time, and then from there, did it stay the same? And it didn't. It wasn't one ritual. He compiled something, then he compiled something else again, and then he did it again. So you can't just pick one point in time and freeze it. It does him an injustice, because he didn't just write one thing at one time and then he was done. Like so many other authors or writers, if you choose to just take what they said in like one period of time and neglect the fact that they lived for another 20 or 40 years, you're omitting that something probably changed at that time. And I don't believe that what he first taught was actually intended to be a full ritual. And you can tell that because when you look at Webb's first edition of his monitor in 1797, bits of it start to disappear as Webb keeps on printing further successive editions. The 1802 edition, you remove the whole section on friendship. Well, too much information and it doesn't fit our style of work. Bang, out it goes. Why? Because Preston probably didn't get it. And there's consistent reports, like I said, of people saying, I didn't give all of this. So I hope I kind of answered that. I know in this it's kind of difficult to go as fully into it as I'd like, but those are the kind of questions people should be asking. How many people would have even known it? Not many. I mean, you would have had to go to London to work with Preston. It's not like everybody is shipping it out into the provinces. And we know it wasn't being used everywhere. We know that it wasn't. But there were some things that were. And one of them is a ritual by a guy named William Finch. Finch's probably adapts bits of Preston to a modern style. And Finch was consistently used out in the provinces. We have letters from lodges talking to the Grand Secretary in London, and they say, I can find no better ritual in use here than Finch. Should we use it? And then they've got to make a decision. And the answer is, probably not supposed to, it's not the official thing, etc. But probably a wink and a nod is, well, it probably is. And essentially part of that is adapted for the post-union ritual, right? Similarly, for the ancients, like we talked about, they're all using Jacob and Boaz, and we know that consistently. Hand-changed copies here and there exist. Reports, there are court cases. There's a court case in Scotland where somebody is accused of talking about Freemasonry with something, and in the court case, you can go find the record of this. They say, oh yeah, we're using Jacob and Boaz and the lodge for the ritual. It makes sense. One is used by the ancients, one is used by the moderns. William Preston probably changed his rituals from time to time, probably didn't have a final formalized ritual initially, and probably adapted as it went. Did that help? Probably no.
Yeah, I really appreciate the explanation.
Yeah.
It just seemed, as we're going through this, I was reading a book about a year ago, Bart Ehrman talking about the Latin Vulgate, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they commissioned this exquisite Bible.
Yeah.
It seems as though maybe that should be your project.
Yeah. So I've been collecting that material, and anybody who's seen any of the stuff I've got, it's so much. And you can track minutes of these things. Like I mentioned, we have letters from people to each other. I'm probably running up against some time now, but are there any other questions? I'm happy to answer if there's anything else. If you think I'm wrong, challenge me, and I'd like to find out, could I answer that? And if I don't have the answer, maybe I need to change my opinion on the weight of better evidence. But that's kind of how I follow this, just so you guys know. Rather than take the story as accepted, you just say, I wonder if that ritual still exists. And you go bang on a door somewhere, and it turns out it does. And then you go, well, I wonder if that letter still exists. And it turns out it usually does. And then you go, I wonder if they mentioned that in the minutes or the proceedings somewhere. It turns out they usually did. Any of you could follow the same steps I did. You don't need a specialized degree. You don't need specialized training. You just need to keep following the hunt until you get several answers. And then you have to be wise enough to discriminate and go, well, here's the story as told. Does that jive with the evidence in front of us? And nope, it usually doesn't. And that makes it far more exciting. So anybody, if you see me tonight, I've got a couple more fun and exciting stories that I'd like to tell as I wrap up here. And they're going to involve some slightly vulgar parts, because those are the good bits. You know the real people at the time, people accusing each other of having excrement on their hands, so to speak, as a metaphor. Somebody having bad case of maybe the trots from eating bad clams and stuff. Real Masons involved in this stuff, and that's how you know it's real. These guys don't tell those stories unless it's actually involved. So, any further questions before I finish? All right, thank you.